Welcome to the third online event in the Urban Institute Georgetown Law series on health justice. We'll focus today on the sudden steep drop-off in entry into the medical profession by members of marginalized racial and ethnic groups. We'll review recently released data documenting this decline, and we'll report on what the evidence shows about this decline's worrisome health implications. We'll then consider the strategies available to medical educators and institutions intent on reversing this decline. And we'll address the troubling phenomenon of fear-driven flight from commitment to equal protection in the health sphere, flight that's not required by law and that puts healthcare institutions at risk of violating the law. We're grateful to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for financial support and to Georgetown Law and our dean, Bill Traynor, for in-kind support. I thank Miriam Allen, our Health Justice Fellow, for producing this event, and Wilhelm Engelbrecht, Robbie Angaroni, and Kyle Benaros at Georgetown for their superb tech assistance. And a shout out to my counterpart at Urban, Brian Smedley, and to his extraordinary team for the collaboration that's making this web series possible. Now to our focus today. Efforts to sustain current levels of minority presence in the clinical caregiving professions, let alone to expand this presence, face storm force headwinds. Who'd have imagined before last month that the federal government would order deletion of a clause barring Jim Crow-style racial segregation from all federal contracts? Who'd have thought before last Wednesday that the Department of Defense would delete a tribute to Jackie Robinson's military service from its website? Each day brings multiple shocks. The Trump administration is achieving what Steve Bannon calls muzzle velocity. Above all, the Trump administration is doing what no prior presidency had dared to try. It's weaponizing the hundreds of billions of dollars in federal funding for colleges and universities and for healthcare institutions to force the rapid rollback of more than a half century of progress toward racial justice. Leaders in academia and healthcare are terrified, and they've been acting accordingly. They've been scared also by the Trump administration's aggressive overreading of the U.S. Supreme Court's 2023 decision striking down affirmative action in college admissions. There have been myriad reports of institutions stripping their websites of references to DEI, discouraging proposals and even publications that are too equity forward and otherwise backing away from commitments to inclusion. That much of this leveraging of federal funding is likely unlawful, that it's contrary to legal doctrines crafted by conservatives to limit progressives' use of federal funding as leverage, seems too often beside the point. Move fast and break things is Team Trump's Silicon Valley-inspired mantra, and lots can be broken within universities and healthcare institutions before the court's cumbersome mechanisms can be brought to bear. Our panelists will address this breakage, the harm that's already been done to efforts to make America's clinical caregivers look more like America, and the likely impact on Americans' health. But they'll also offer a reason for hope, not pie-in-the-sky hope, but realism, grounded in keeping cool in the face of the current onslaught and thinking strategically about medical education admissions practice. All of our panelists will speak for themselves, not as representatives of their home institutions. Each will offer about 5 or 6 minutes of introductory remarks. We'll then seg to a discussion among our panelists for about 20 minutes. We'll then go to your questions. Please submit questions at any time via the questions tab at the bottom of your screen at any point. And please don't be shy about doing so. Miriam Allen will curate the questions and pass them on to me. I'll briefly introduce the speakers now. You can learn lots more about them online. A nasty respiratory bug has paid our scheduled first speaker, Dr. David Acosta from the Association of American Medical Colleges, an untimely visit. But we're very fortunate to have Dr. Norma Paul Hunter, the association's Senior Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, to step in for David and to start us off with the troubling story of double-digit percentage point decline in the presence of African American, Latino, and Native American students in this year's nationwide class of first-year medical students. Dr. Brian Smedley, Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute and a national leader in the quest to eliminate disparities in health and medical care, will follow Norma. I first met Brian 20 years back when he was staff director for the Institute of Medicine Committee on Racial Disparities, on which I served. Brian co-authored the committee's report, Unequal Treatment, and has served in leadership roles with the American Psychological Association, the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and the National Collaborative for Health Equity. Brian will speak to the available evidence on the differences in health outcomes and in clinical trust that enriched diversity among clinical caregivers can make. Next up will be Dr. Demisha Rankin, Associate Dean for Admissions, Professor of Anesthesiology, and Vice Chair for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at The Ohio State University College of Medicine, Department of Anesthesiology. Norma is a national leader in the development and implementation of what's come to be known as holistic admissions, an approach to nurturing, recruiting, and selection of future physicians based on their distance traveled, as she puts it, and their full range of capabilities, rather than just test scores and GPA. She'll talk about how this strategy can sustain diversity even in the face of the current headwinds. Finally, we'll hear from Ruqaiya Yerbi, Karen J. Trott, professor in health law at The Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law, and a national leader in the illumination of mechanisms of structural racism in medical care, vaccine policy, and housing. Ruqaiya will argue that too many of us are too afraid of current legal and political headwinds, that there's been much overreaction and unnecessary retreat from commitments to diversity and equal protection in the health sphere, and that indeed the law requires that medical institutions sustain these commitments. Let's go now to Norma Paul.
Thank you, Greg. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Norma. Go ahead.
Wonderful.
Go ahead.
Thank you. It's great to be with you here today. I'm going to provide an update on the AMC, Association of American Medical Colleges, applicant and matriculant data for MD granting institutions. For those of you who are not familiar with AMC, AMC's mission is to improve the health of everyone, people everywhere. And as part of that, we represent 172 accredited MD granting institutions across the United States, including Puerto Rico and in Canada. And as you see here, several health systems as well as academic societies. In terms of what is important to understand, to provide some context about why we're here today, is really to look at this key issue of our North Star, addressing projected physician workforce shortages, which tell us that we need to be able to attract all the qualified talent that we can across the United States. The headlines for what this current entering medical school class looks like tells us that we have a lot of work to be done. We see a general decline in the total number of MD applicants by 1.2%. There is an increase in first-time applicants by 2.3%. However, there's a decline in applicants identifying as American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, and white. Women still comprise the majority of applicants, but we do see a decline in applicants whose socioeconomic status of their parents is less than a bachelor's degree. When we look more closely at the data by race and ethnicity, Greg hinted at the concerns related to the declines. Here we see a decline of applicants who identify as American Indian and Alaska Native in double digits, 15.4%. For white applicants, we see a decline as well at 5.2%, and other groups have seen an overall increase. When we consider the matriculant data, those students who are matriculating to medical school in the academic year 2024-2025, we see that there is a small growth in the number of matriculants at MD granting institutions. However, we see double-digit declines for individuals who identify as American Indian, Alaska Native, Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, and some declines for whites. Women comprise the majority of matriculants, although there was a slight decline this year compared to last year. There was also a decline in matriculants whose socioeconomic status of their parents was less than a bachelor's degree. Looking more closely at the data of matriculation by race and ethnicity, we see that there's a troubling concern of the double-digit declines for American Indian Alaska Native at 22.1%, Black African American at 11.6%, and Hispanic Latino at 10.8%, and just a small decline of white applicants. We expected that these declines would occur, especially in light of the SCOTUS decision to end the use of race in admissions. However, we did not expect that these declines would be so significant. When we look at the medical school applicant and matriculant pool overall, we also must consider the schools of osteopathic medicine. And we see that they have a different set of trends here, showing that individuals who they classify as URM, African American, Latino, American Indian, Alaska Native, as well as Native Hawaiian, they did see an uptick in terms of the matriculation compared to 2023. So to summarize the data, we did see a decline in the total number of applicants to MD granting institutions in this year. There was a significant double-digit decline, not only in the application, but in the matriculation rates for individuals identifying as American Indian Alaska Native. There was also declines in the number of matriculants from racial ethnic groups, American Indian Alaska Native, Black African American, Hispanic Latino, and Native and Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. And in the case of the three groups, Black African American, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Hispanic, they were double digits as well in matriculation. We see a decline in applicants and matriculants for those students whose parents have less than a bachelor's degree. And we have to also recognize that there are differences in the MD and Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine application and matriculation rates by race and ethnicity. I'll turn it back over to Greg.
Thank you very much, Norma. And we'll turn next to Brian Smedley. Brian.
Thank you so much, Greg. I, too, want to join you in thanking the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for their generous support of this collaboration between the Urban Institute and the Georgetown University Law Center. This is a collaboration intended to stimulate interdisciplinary collaboration toward advancing health equity, particularly between the civil rights law and the social science and health equity research sectors. Today, I'm very pleased to summarize the findings of a new brief that we've released entitled Racially Minoritized Patients Can Benefit from Racially Concordant Providers but Struggle to Provide Them. I want to thank my colleagues Dulce Gonzalez and Taylor Nelson for their superb work on this brief. This brief is available now on the Urban Institute website, and you should be able to see a link to this brief in the chat. This brief both summarizes the existing literature on the potential benefits of racial concordance between patients and providers, and it also presents some original research from the Urban Institute's own Health Reform Monitoring Survey, which I'll talk about shortly. First, to start with the literature, what does the research say about racial concordance between physicians and patients? We extensively reviewed this literature and found that patients of color in concordant dyads, that is, the same race or ethnicity as the patient, are more likely to be satisfied with their physician visits. They rate their physicians more highly than those in discordant dyads, and rate their visits as more participatory compared to racially and ethnically discordant dyads. We also found that having a racially concordant provider was positively associated with patient adherence to provider-recommended treatment and medication, use of preventive health care, and acceptance of more invasive forms of preventive health services. Research on the association of patient-provider concordance on patient outcomes has been much more limited than studies of the relationship between concordance and access to care as well as care process measures. But these studies generally suggest a positive relationship. Most recently, published within the last few weeks, Shannon and colleagues found that racial and ethnic patient surgeon concordance was associated with lower postoperative readmission rates and lower lengths of stay for Hispanic patients when their surgeon shared their same ethnic background. This study looked at patients and providers in California along 14 different common surgical procedures such as hip replacement, knee replacement surgeries, and again suggests that for Hispanic patients, having a surgeon of the same racial or ethnic background is associated with better patient outcomes than for those patients in discordant dyads. There's also research suggesting a relationship between the geographic density of providers of color and the health status of certain people of color. For example, one recent study found that as the density of Black primary care providers at the county level increases, Black mortality decreases and Black life expectancy increases. So much so that the investigators found a dose-response relationship whereby every 10% increase in African-American primary care density in a county was associated with a 30-day longer life expectancy for African Americans. Turning now to Urban's Health Reform Monitoring Survey, we looked at preferences for racially concordant providers among patients of different racial and ethnic groups. This slide shows the share of adults 18 to 64 with a preference for a concordant provider and the share who are actually in racially concordant dyads with their usual provider. As you can see from these data, overwhelmingly, patients of color desire patients of their same racial or ethnic group. African Americans, for example, 32% report that they share a preference for a racially or ethnically concordant provider, but only 18% actually are in concordant relationships with a healthcare provider. White patients are actually 4 times more likely than African American patients to be in racially concordant dyads with their primary healthcare provider. As you can see from this slide, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and individuals from other racial and ethnic groups all expressed a stronger desire for racially concordant relationships with their provider than white patients, but they had much more difficulty finding those providers. This slide shows the share of adults who report that it is difficult or very difficult to find a provider who is of their same racial or ethnic background. As you can see from this slide, only about 4% of white adults who seek a racially concordant provider report that it is difficult or very difficult to find a provider of their same racial or ethnic group. In contrast, 36% of African Americans, 29% of Asian Americans, 22% of Hispanic Americans, and 24% of individuals of other racial and ethnic groups reported that it is difficult or very difficult to find a provider of their same racial or ethnic background. Finally, we looked at the share of adults 18 to 64 reporting a preference for a racially concordant provider who had concerns about future unfair treatment in healthcare settings because of their race, ethnicity, or primary language. Among adults who are not concerned about treating unfairly, white adults, about 6% reported a preference for a racially concordant provider. Among white adults who are concerned about being treated unfairly, 24% reported having a preference for a racially concordant provider. So about 4 times as many white adults reported who have concerns about being treated unfairly reported having a preference for a racially concordant provider. But this relationship was even stronger for African American and Latinx or Hispanic patients. About 25% of African Americans who are not concerned about being treated unfairly had a preference for racially concordant providers. About 45% of African American adults concerned about being treated unfairly had a preference for a racially concordant provider, and approximately similar percentages of Hispanic patients report the same results. So taken together, these findings strongly suggest that many patients of color, particularly those who are concerned about potential unfair treatment in healthcare settings, seek providers of their own racial or ethnic background. But for Black, Latinx, and Hispanic and American Indian patients, it can be much more difficult to find providers of those same racial and ethnic backgrounds. And again, you can access this report on Urban's website. I thank you so much. I'll turn it back to Greg.
Thank you very much, Brian. Demisha Rankin.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I do want to be able to provide some strategies to support future physician workforce. And so I know that there are some strategies in medical school admissions. We have missions that we have to work and we must do, and we all play a pivotal role in shaping the physician workforce. And so underlying our work is a commitment to equity. And so I want to be able to provide some very brief overview of some strategies to help us move forward, of which include recruitment strategies, admissions practices that we can consider, as well as we know that it's not just enough to get our students in the door, but we must have mechanisms to support and retain our students, because the work that we do is absolutely going to be impactful for many years beyond the actual admissions process, because many of these individuals will practice for 30 plus years. And so it is imperative and crucial that the accepted students must be prepared to take care of the patient populations which exist. And this is inclusive of recruiting students with a broad range of lived experiences who will take care of patients from all walks of life. In this period of time, we have to remember that we have to be forward thinking, we have to be courageous, and we have to be collaborative, especially in this time and space where words that are meant to infuse respect, opportunity, and equal considerations are being weaponized. And at the same time, we have to be strategic. And I think we have to remember that not long ago, we were in a viral pandemic, and there were some awesome and amazing solutions that were born out of stressful situations. And so we must be prepared to play chess rather than checkers. And so again, I'm going to try and offer some optimistic framework. Of course, these are just some examples and should be considered within the context of your respective institutions and existing laws, which more to come on that. So as we get started, I just want to take a moment again to contextualize how many students are applying to medical school. Norma kind of shared a little bit about this, and I've offered this report here where students reflect their self-identified race and ethnicity. And as you can see, there is a difference in the volume based upon these characteristics. And so this is present over many cycles. 5 cycles are represented here. And if you think about the competitiveness of getting into medical school, there are more than about 50,000 students applying, and only about 40% of students matriculate concerning MD matriculations. And so this is something that I think is important, because there is a saying that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And so again, as gatekeepers to the profession, we must have objective systems in place to seek out the best candidates amongst these numbers. And so we also at the same time have to recognize that there will be variability in the path that each student has taken to get to us. The first pillar I want to dive into is that of recruitment. And I want to offer some very simple definitions that recruitment is not an acceptance decision. The Supreme Court decision that was handed down was specifically for acceptance decisions. In many instances, recruitment can be targeted for specific demographics so long as it is open to all. So I think having intentional outreach and creative pathway programs, whether they're directed at students in high schools who are under-resourced, or outreach to college students from diverse backgrounds, varying socioeconomic statuses, affinity organizations, and having the ability to offer programs like shadowing, mentoring, internships, or summer enrichment programs can foster interest in medicine early. Pathway programs are the takeaway point from that is that these are long-term and early investments in mentorship and partnership, which can tap into a students at any point, whether it be K through 12 education, undergraduates, as well as internships and opportunities. And so these pathway programs can provide students with guidance and insights into careers in medicine. And so it can't just be a one and done, long-term investments. And then promoting financial accessibility is important, because we know that in addition to making things affordable, also providing financial literacy, which can help to understand improvement of how to navigate such spaces, as well as remove barriers. Medical schools, of course, this is a lofty idea, but could work more to offering scholarships for students who are offering more scholarships or lower interest loans, for students who have socioeconomic disadvantage, who are first generation MDs, whose parents does not have a bachelor degree, or other social factors. And what about identifying students who went to high schools that were under-resourced, or students whose schools had high ratios of students receiving free lunch, rather than just identifying students based upon merit to award scholarships. So these are ways that we can really find solutions to problems that exist by removing some of these barriers. And then increasing outreach by using technology and virtual platforms to broaden our audience. We have to face it, technology is not going away. And in terms of ways or examples to really operationalize outreach, I have an example here. And this is an example of a pathway program that is actually hot off the press, recently published here in the Columbus area, and it's featuring a program called Made for Medicine. And this is a long-term investment pathway program in students at various ages, usually starting at 6 to 7, and it is intended to be able to provide visibility to what it means to be a physician or be in healthcare. And so this is one example of what we can do in terms of investing in our students. And the other one, of course, the AAMC is here present today, but really taking advantage of technology. It costs money for organizations to attend these virtual fairs, but this really is an opportunity to be creative with your time and your space, and it allows you to be in front of students that otherwise may have accessibility issues because of geography, and they don't have the ability to travel. And also using platforms, social media platforms, to be able to partner and collaborate with minority-serving institutions and collaborating with historically Black colleges and universities. We have to be able to leverage our technology to be able to do this. The next thing I want to dive into really briefly is admission practice. And I think the biggest thing that we can take away is composition of our committees. Really lean into who is on the committee. How can you diversify the committee? Because if there's representation there and if there's broad lived experiences, this can influence the decisions that a committee is making in terms of who is accepted. It is important to think about training the committee. And while it may be prohibitive in terms of including implicit bias and things like that, may not be made to make a requirement, but there should be intentional instruction on how to be objective in reviewing candidates. And there should be some quality metrics or some quality assurance that the committee members are sticking to that. I think the biggest takeaway is leaning into holistic review. As Greg mentioned, takes more than just a perfect MCAT or GPA to matriculate into medical school. There are other factors. In fact, there's a whole list of 17 competencies last time I checked. And so academic capacity is certainly one aspect, but they also have to have compassion, empathy, resiliency, grit, and that is not measured by an academic metric. Again, leveraging technology and using tools that can help inform healthcare needs. And here's a pretty fascinating one I want to share with you guys in terms of operationalizing admission practices. Dr. Mark Henderson has been credited with and creating and utilizing a novel tool at UC Davis School of Medicine. And many schools have adopted and modified this same premise in terms of looking at socioeconomic disadvantage score. And this provides a way to really lean into your holistic admissions, removing bias that may exist, and enriching holistic review. And there are many variables that are included in this, but again, it just adds an additional way. Another additional way, in addition to an SED score, really allow for a moment the opportunity to consider an admissions process to more fully consider a student's path to medicine that they've experienced from their K through 12 years. This is the Childhood Opportunity Index, and this is a fascinating tool. If you have not heard about it, I'd encourage you to take a look. It is a collaboration where the focus is understanding the core question is, regardless of where someone lives, what is their opportunity index based upon education, green space, food, pollution, and other resources? So something to think about if this is something you could incorporate into your admissions practices. Additionally, what about the idea of using geospatial data to identify pools of applicants who come from underserved areas? Because we already heard a little bit about if increasing the number of physicians in a particular area, if that helps health outcomes. why not consider qualified candidates who may emerge from the use of such geographic data, who also could demonstrate grit, resiliency, and an opportunity to go back to these communities to help advance and reduce healthcare disparities. And then lastly, we cannot forget about the potential of artificial intelligence in the admissions process. Of course, the volume of applications has always been a hurdle for medical school admissions committees. But if there's a way to really refine this process, utilize this technology so that programs can identify students who are mission aligned, this would be helpful. And then lastly, strategies to move forward in terms of retaining and supporting our students. Mentorship, peer and faculty is absolutely crucial for our students. We have to be able to incorporate resources into the curriculum rather than making students responsible for these things on their own. And then we have to track outcomes and inform impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Demisha. Rukiah Yerby.
Thank you. So let me share my slides. Thank you for having me here. I do want to go ahead and share a disclaimer. So recent federal actions, particularly since Trump has entered office, have called into question the ability for individuals to be able to continue to do diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So I want to speak about that a little bit more, and I am going to do so by talking about some of the executive orders, in particular, the Ending Illegal Discrimination order, and get into the Students for Fair Admissions case. So when you take a look at this order, Trump tends to say that DEIA practices are illegal, but that actually misstates the law and what the Students for Fair Admissions case said. So the Students for Fair Admissions case said, particularly, it was focusing on whether diversity in education was a compelling interest. And it said that it was not as it pertained to only college admissions, and one could argue as it pertains only to Harvard and North Carolina's admission practices. One of the reasons they said this is because that it was not time limited, and that race was used as a stereotype or a negative. And so with that, I'm going to briefly summarize what the case did. So it addressed Harvard and University of North Carolina's college admission practices. And why I say it addressed those college admission practices is because most colleges have different admission practices. And so they're not similar. It cannot necessarily be just compared to Harvard and North Carolina. It exempted military schools. It continued to say that race-neutral practices and policies are still legal. Students can still discuss their race to highlight challenges they have overcome. And court said race-based programs can be used to do away with governmentally imposed discrimination based on race. So what was not addressed in the case? Anything regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, policies, or practices. You will not see any discussion of those things in that case, nor does it discuss anything around accessibility. It does not talk about admissions programs, college admissions programs outside of Harvard and North Carolina. And contrary to how people have responded, it did not address any graduate admissions practices, policies, or programs. So, when we turn now to a discussion of the executive order, myself and others have noted that they go beyond the president's powers. Why? Because the Students for Fair Admissions case did not address, speak, even review anything related to DEI practices. It did not discuss anything related to graduate admissions programs. And on the screen, you can see this memorandum that was drafted by university offices of general counsels, university leaders, law professors who note some of the problems with that executive order. One particularly that and this is the second point, that common DEI initiatives are lawful under prevailing federal civil rights law and Supreme Court precedent and allowable under state law. So after the executive order, we also see the issuance of a Dear Colleague letter. And in this Dear Colleague letter, again, the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, Acting Assistant Secretary tried to say that colleges had to comply with the executive order. And the response from the Educational Council and others have noted that all efforts to advance DEI are not categorically unlawful. Second, the skewed and incomplete discussion of the SFA, Students for Fair Admission case, telegraphs the political taint of the letter. And third, the acting secretary's threat of imminent action is significantly undercut by his recognition that the letter does not have the focus and effect of the law and does not bind the public. And so just in summary, and I'm going to go in response later to talk about ways that universities, medical schools can respond. Just to be clear, the executive order is not based on law. The president has no authority to create new laws. The whole point of the executive branch is to enforce the laws. Only the legislature can create new laws, and the Supreme Court can interpret the laws. And neither the legislature, both federal and state, have ruled past things to say that DEI practices are illegal. And the courts have not spoken about this in the Students for Fair Admissions case. And so with that, I will conclude and then continue with my discussion of how to respond once we get to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rukiah. And let's begin our conversation. We'll go for about 20 minutes, and then we'll go to questions from our viewers. And I'd like to start off by asking you, Rukiah, and perhaps Demisha can also join in on this. What are some of the things, more specifically, that medical schools and others involved in the training of our clinical caregivers can do that they're showing right now that they're afraid of doing? And what recommendations would you make, both with respect to fears that are leading some to peel back from activities that they're allowed to engage in, and with respect to ways of being proactive?
Yes, thank you for that. So I'll go back to my slides and to just highlight. So do not pre-comply. Why don't you want to pre-comply? Because it leaves you vulnerable to lawsuits from individuals with disabilities, LGBTQIA+, racial and ethnic minority individuals, and women for failing to comply with federal and state anti-discrimination laws and cases. And so think about that as the counter to pre-compliance or over-compliance, because what you are actually doing is violating the law. You can strengthen programs by showing how the program's policies and practices fulfill your legal duties and fulfill the mission of the institution. And so one example of this is the Georgetown law dean who received a letter warning him that the Georgetown Law School needed to stop their DEI practices. And in response, he noted that, again, this is connected to the First Amendment's protections, but it was also connected to the university's mission as a Jesuit and Catholic university. And medical schools need to lean in on that. Also, one thing you can do is revise the language of health equity and diversity to include equality and equal protection and discrimination. And so what does that look like? That means that when we define equality, in the past, we have defined it in ways that are very limiting and discriminatory. And we need to define it more broadly. Equality means that everyone gets what they need in equal measure. It doesn't mean that you only give one thing that fits all. That does not fit all to everybody. It means that everybody gets what they need in equal measure. And And that is what equality means. Also, when we think about in the past, we really tried to not connect structural racism and racial discrimination. This is a slide that shows they are connected. When we think about disparate treatment, it is the ways that laws and policies and practices advantage one group over another. And we do see that in medical school sometimes, particularly, I'm going to give you an example of when we use admission policies and practices that give preferential treatment to white individuals, even though they are not connected to the ability of people to actually be great doctors. And one example of this is the MCAT. Yes, the MCAT is great for being able to determine if somebody's going to do well on their exams, but research has shown that that does not necessarily track to them being great doctors. And so really thinking about admissions practices, what standards are you using? Is it going to be connected to the ability of somebody to be a good doctor, and making sure that that merit decision is based on true merit, which is the ability to be a great doctor. So with that, I will stop sharing and I look forward to more questions.
And the only thing I can offer to add to that is that really highlighting the fact that perhaps more credence should be given to admissions processes and blinding MCAT scores early in the process, especially once a particular threshold has been met, because data does show we do have information that says that after a particular threshold, students have a wide variety of success. Plus, again, there are equally important and other factors that we have to talk about and really, really lean into. And so also maybe there needs to be more less consideration of the average MCAT in a matriculating class influencing school rankings and things like that, because there's downstream consequences that we have to consider, or that have been considered, that we don't necessarily have to continue to do so, because the goal is creating and generating physicians that are going to take care of people tomorrow. And so it's much more than just grades. And I also have to say that really leaning into representation on your committees really can help influence who is accepted because of lived experiences and adds to the diversity of the class.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I have a question for Brian. You showed pretty potent evidence that there's a stronger preference that minority patients have compared to white patients for racially concordant providers. And I worry that some might interpret that in a pernicious sort of way. And I'm wondering, can we see this as a measure of these patients' greater fear and anxiety and consequent distrust about a medical system that they see as largely white, as largely apart from them? What are your thoughts about that? I realize that there might not be, potent empirical evidence to answer this particular question. But do you have any impressions? And is there empirical data out there that speaks to this?
Sure. Thanks for that, Greg. So patients of color and their experiences in healthcare settings are very real. Prior research that my colleagues have done at the Urban Institute finds that patients of color are much more likely than white patients to report experiences of unfair or discriminatory treatment. And those experiences, coupled with the experiences of family members and the entire history of how African Americans and other people of color have been treated in healthcare systems and by the medical establishment. Folks know that history very well. And so this is not a made up or illusory perception that these patients have. And couple that with the fact that patients of color have been documented for years receiving a lower quality of healthcare, in part due to structural factors, in part due to factors related to the clinical encounter itself. And so all of those complex factors come together to shape the experiences of patients of color. Our data clearly indicate that almost all adults who fear unfair treatment on the basis of race or ethnicity, including white patients, prefer a provider of their own racial or ethnic background, but that sense is much more striking among patients of color, given that very real history of the treatment of patients of color in our healthcare systems, personal experiences that individuals have had, experiences of family members, and taken together, this suggests that this is more than a notion that patients of color fear an unfair treatment on the basis of something illusory.
And it's also worth underscoring, isn't it, that we are not talking about, you are not talking about some kind of mandatory assignment, some kind of mandatory concordance. We're talking about the choices that patients make, not that providers make, the choices that patients make about who they want to be their doctor. And that has long been seen throughout the history of our country. That has long been seen to be the province of patients to choose their own doctors. And ironically, people who are most disadvantaged economically typically have the least choice. If you are on Medicaid, there's a whole lot of doctors that won't be seeing you because they don't accept Medicaid.
Yes, that's correct. And so as a policy matter, it is not our objective to match every patient one-to-one in terms of race and ethnicity. That would be very, very difficult. And obviously, it would be a huge impediment for patients of color, given the underrepresentation of providers from Black, Latinx, and American Indian backgrounds. The point is to expand choice for those that seek that choice. And it's not to suggest that patients providers who are dissimilar from their patients in terms of their racial or ethnic background cannot adequately treat those patients. The point is that diversity in medical schools, diversity in training settings helps all providers to feel much more confident in their ability to manage diversity in their clinical practice. Study after study points this out, that medical students in more diverse settings report having greater confidence in their ability to address cultural, linguistic factors that may pose barriers. So the point here is to expand choice, not to match patients and providers one-to-one in race and ethnicity in every instance, and particularly to help the aggregate of providers to overcome linguistic and cultural barriers that they may experience.
The excuse me. The Students for Fair Admissions case, the case in which a U.S. Supreme Court struck down the admissions programs at both Harvard and University of North Carolina, there's a tantalizing footnote in that case, and Rukai already alluded to it. It's a footnote that suggests that there are unique concerns that our military academies have because of the central role of diversity in an effective fighting force. And that those concerns might merit an exception to the rules set down in the SFFA cases. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, and I'll direct this in particular to Norma. I know you're not a lawyer, but perhaps you have a sense of what kinds of conversations have played out within the American Association of Medical College, the Association of American Medical Colleges, within some of your member institutions. So I will address it to you, and also to Rukiah. What hope is there for making that argument with respect to medical institutions? Since, hey, being realistic, a whole lot more people die of disease prematurely in any given year than die because nation states are invading America, with apologies to Mr. Trump and his liberal use of that invasion word. So we're talking about people's security. Hey, people are a whole lot more afraid of deadly illness than they are of being invaded, even by the Russians. So what about the possible role of this military exception type argument in the healthcare setting?
Thanks for that. Just adding to what Brian shared in terms of the existing research, we know based on existing data and research that diversity really contributes to greater access to care. And so we know that if we want healthy citizens who are able to work and be productive in our nation, they need to be healthy. They need to have access to care. And for example, you mentioned earlier that some individuals who have Medicaid and Medicare are less likely to possibly receive care because many providers do not accept Medicaid and Medicare, where the data bears out that women, physicians who identify as African American, Latino, American Indian, Alaska Native are more likely to provide services to patients who have Medicaid and Medicare. So when we talk about an exception, we understand that access to healthcare is critical for the survival of our nation, for people to be productive citizens. And so as a result, we know that we need to be able to attract all available talent that's qualified into our medical schools to address healthcare shortages that I mentioned earlier, as well as the persistent healthcare disparities that exist for many communities across the U.S.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
So I would say I'm going to use a little different language because I am a lawyer and I'm being very specific for why, right? So my frame is more about equality and equal protection. So first of all, going back to the case, they specifically said college admissions practices. They did not say graduate admissions practices. And when you go back to University of Michigan cases, there was a split, right? They looked at the college admissions practice and the law school admissions practices. So unfortunately, I think many schools have rolled back programs that they didn't need to because the court only was asked to review college admissions practices. So the current practices used by medical schools, graduate schools, are still legal until the court says they're not, or until there's legislation that says they're not. And so there are some states that have already passed, state, Michigan, right, already passed laws that said you could not use race. California did, Texas did. And so all of those programs are still legal, right, because they're not changed by Students for Fair Admissions. And if we're talking about sort of an exemption, I would not try to fit it under diversity. I would talk about the ways that we are actually trying to fulfill either the mission of the school, which should be to serve everyone and to create doctors that can do that, but to ensure that we are using admissions practices, recruiting practices that ensure that everybody has an equal opportunity, right? And to be able to do that, we need to think about, do the standards actually connect to the things that we want people to do? But also, does it give everybody a fair opportunity, right? And so just building on what Norma said, right? Instead of saying diversity, I would say equality and equal protection. And people are already doing things to get to that, but I would be clearer about connecting the work that is being done to that mission and that legal duty.
So Rukiah is doing, for the non-lawyers in the audience, which I dare speculate probably includes most of you. For the non-lawyers in the audience, Rukiah is showing how good a lawyer she is by distinguishing the SFFA case, the Supreme Court's affirmative action case, on its facts. I'm picking up that general counsels that are advising admissions staff in graduate and professional programs at universities are, for the most part, not drawing that distinction. Is there a way? Are there ways that you can get that argument out there in the hope that maybe not all of them will buy it, but maybe some of them will try it because there's a need, well, for, dare I say it, a little bit of courage in going forth with this argument. Maybe it's a way in combination with the rationale that the court invited for military academies, at least. Maybe it's a way to carve out a different story, to tell a different story for certain kinds of professional admissions. What can be done to deliver the message you've just delivered about distinguishing the SFFA case to those who are giving advice that medical school admissions committees are relying on?
So what I would say is that to impress upon them that they're leaving themselves vulnerable to lawsuits. And I don't think that they understand that. I think that we have begun to only focus on groups that are threatening to sue, which tend to be conservative groups fighting against diversity. But there are still laws on the books, right? Equality means equality. It doesn't mean reshaping policies just because you're worried about lawsuits from conservative groups. It means that there are laws on the books that say that you need to equally protect everyone. And so, for example, that would be people cutting African American programs. It means but still celebrating St. Patrick's Day, right? That's not equality. So being very clear about the programs that you're cutting, and if you're going to open all programs to everybody because you think that that's a way for equality, then that means that everybody has to have access to it. So that means you have to actually have those programs open to individuals with disabilities and make sure they can participate, right? So this could be an opportunity for the expansion of programs. But general counsels have to understand that if you overcomply, then there are going to be a lot of lawsuits from individuals with disabilities, from racial and ethnic minorities, from women, because you are limiting their ability for equal protection, right? And I'll just take this one other second, Greg. As you mentioned, there is no, since Trump rolled back, there's no explicit prohibiting um, segregated water facilities, segregation. Now, I would hope that most people would understand that if they return to separate and unequal, that there will be lots of lawsuits immediately in the courts. And what I'm saying is the same thing is going to happen if you overcomply with some of these DEI measures and admissions practices. Somebody put in the question and answer that California has done a lot of amazing things, and we need to take note of those things that they have done. And so is Michigan, when there were explicit prohibitions against using race and gender. And so other schools, general counsels need to take heart to that and still stand firm on their requirements under equal protection for all.
Thank you. And let's let that be a segue to questions from you, our viewers and audience. And we won't be able to get to all of them, but I will do my best. One question that's been asked is, how does this legal landscape apply to other groups in this country that have not traditionally been measured or taken account of in the same way as the groups on Norma Pole Hunter's slides, but that nevertheless are minorities in this country that face some disadvantages. And a questioner mentions Arab Americans as one example. I'm sure you all can think of other groups. And how does this new legal landscape apply, say, to Arab Americans? And anybody who wants to should jump in. You can spontaneously speak, I say to the panelists. No need to raise hands or be unduly polite.
Well, Greg, I think part of the question was also about improving the accuracy of representation and equitable inclusion of students who identify as Arab American or Middle Eastern. And we are actually improving the data collection in that sense. So we will be adding kind of disaggregating that information. So in our application to medical school, MCAT, we will begin to collect separately the identity of Middle Eastern and North African applicants. So we'll have a better sense of what their representation is.
And then in terms of holistic admissions, is it a matter of going back to the story of what has each individual had to overcome and what personal characteristics does that individual bring to bear? Does it should it count? Can it count in holistic admissions that somebody, say in the Arab American community or any other of these other minority communities, might be able to go back to his or her community here, or perhaps even in another country, and connect in this concordant way?
Absolutely. I mean, diversity is good. It is not a bad word. Just like if you ask a financial advisor, how should their stock portfolio be compromised? They will tell you a diverse portfolio. You don't want investment into just one thing. And it's no different with medicine. We absolutely need everyone from all walks of life that have that distant travel, that have that resiliency, that have that grit, that have taken the most of the opportunities that they have or did not have.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question that's come in, I'm going to ask it in a bit of a broader way. And maybe I should direct this question first to Ruqayyah. There are a whole variety of other federal programs, federal programs and other programs that have historically taken account of racial and ethnic identity. Ruqayyah, could you speak to the question of whether, say, the Area Health Education Center program or other programs are still able to do so, or whether we should infer from the SCOTUS decision in 2023 and from executive orders that's going to be trimmed back, and how the various folks who have to apply, administer these programs should respond to the current environment. I realize I've made a more specific question into a more general question, but there's so many such programs that are not specifically addressed in the SFFA case.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So I would say, quite honestly, none of those programs are just addressed by the Students for Fair Admissions case. Remember, the case was only about college admissions. Now, what President Trump is trying to do is expand it and create a new law. The courts have, many of the courts have said that is illegal. They put it on hold. I cannot necessarily speak to whether the programs will move forward, because what we are seeing, unfortunately, at the federal level is a lot of illegal actions, right? So a lot of taking down of websites that then have to go back up, a lot of stopping of funding, which has already been appropriated by Congress. And so, unfortunately, I can't directly answer that question because we don't know what's happening and what is going to happen at the federal level, because it is so unlike any other time where we just followed by what the powers were of the federal government and the executive branch. So one would hope that those programs will still continue, but I think we'll just have to wait and see. But if you do receive funds, I would continue to provide those services until you're told not to by the federal government, because you still have to operate under those current programs. So, yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. A really good question has just come in from our audience. A question about the possibility that private healthcare payers could play a leveraging role here. And we have seen conversation in the past about private healthcare payers marketing their clinical networks, marketing their plan administration to large employers, in part based on their ability to provide diversity in their networks, and in part based on their commitment, or so they've claimed, and sometimes, to leverage their purchasing power to achieve greater diversity. So can any of you comment on the current potential, given, as Ruqayyah points out, the limits on what the SFFA case actually decided? Can any of you comment on the current potential of healthcare payers that bring large purchasing power to bear, in some markets, monopsony purchasing power, the current potential of healthcare payers to provide a kind of countervailing leverage in the face of this headwind, this kind of political and cultural headwind that's been created over the last 2 months against pursuit of diversity in the healthcare workforce?
Thanks, Greg. I'll take a step at that. I welcome that trend if that is indeed the case. We know that business groups on health around the country have made it clear that as businesses are purchasing benefit plans for their employees, one key consideration, particularly for those that have diverse workforces, is the ability of the plan to deliver equitable care and to produce the best possible outcomes for diverse employee populations. So this is certainly a very welcome trend and suggests that markets, in addition to the law, in addition to political pressure, can be an important way to begin to help bring about reform. One challenge in this space is the collection of data to be able to establish which plans can show evidence that they're delivering more equitable care. And an additional, so we have to be concerned about whether plans will be able to continue to collect data on the basis of patient demographic factors, to continue to monitor care process and outcomes disaggregated by demographic factors. And we have the additional challenge that some providers may be reluctant to share their demographic information, and actually for good reason, because providers themselves, in some cases, face discrimination from patients. But it is essential to know from the plan purchaser perspective, does a plan have evidence of delivering equitable care, and are the networks of their providers adequate to serve diverse patient populations? Those are two questions that if I'm purchasing a health plan, I'd want to know if I have a diverse employee population.
But we're seeing some large private employers, to put it charitably, kind of back away from the commitments that they made and promised to be everlasting in the immediate wake of George Floyd's murder and the response to George Floyd's murder. What, if anything, can be done now by those concerned about this issue to push back on that, back in a way, pardon my bad mix of metaphors here, to push back, at least in the health sphere, so that backing away from that commitment, backing away from diversity and equity commitment does not expand to a backing away from a commitment to seek health plan administrators that have networks that fulfill these aspirations. What can we do? What can others do to kind of, blow back against that wind?
So here again, for me, market forces can play a powerful role to help plans do the right thing, to help providers do the right thing. Key here again is data, and I would add transparency. We've had very little transparency in the effort to create and present equity metrics to a variety of different stakeholders, to plan purchasers, to consumers, to regulators at state and federal levels, creating greater transparency around metrics that can establish whether or not a plan is doing right by diverse patient populations can be a powerful way to promote accountability, but only if those data are shared in ways that are appropriate and accessible to those stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Another questioner asks about whether medical boards, I'm presuming he or she means state medical licensing and disciplinary bodies, what medical boards can do by way of pushback in this realm. And I'd add to that question, I'd broaden that question out by including the principal specialty societies, groups like the American College of Surgeons and the analogous groups for internists, pediatricians, psychiatrists, etc. What role might these groups be mobilized to play? And I wonder if Norma, in particular, if you have any thoughts about that.
Sure. So,
or Demisha. Demisha, I'm sorry. Demisha.
I'd say that the state medical boards are really focusing on the needs of the state, right? And so going back to what our physician workforce needs are based on the needs of the patient population within that state, they're very aware of kind of the current trends and really can inform practices early on to speak to what kind of physician workforce do we need to address the needs in the state, which can inform the practices of our medical schools.
Mhm. And how responsive are medical schools in practice to communications from either medical boards or leadership of the medical specialty societies?
That is a question I don't necessarily have an answer to in terms of how responsive they can be, but I do think there is an opportunity to really appreciate that perspective. And I think even just spanning out, I just really want people that have positions of authority and influence to realize that it is always the right time to do the right thing. We can't continue to have these specialties where it's 90% men and 90% white men. There's nothing wrong with that, but you can't tell me there aren't women interested. You can't tell me that there aren't individuals who identify as African American or Hispanic who aren't interested in these specialties that are heavily skewed in one direction. And so I think really paying attention to unroofing the barriers, really creating a space that everyone that is striving to be that type of physician, regardless of that specialty, that there's a place for them. And it does begin with the individuals who are in leadership roles and have a seat at the table. We can't continue to use these outdated modalities of thinking and expect a different outcome. We have to be courageous and do the right thing and realize that we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion as these three words that are trigger words, but understand that they're not just one category or issues that you could put in one pot. It is actually like a camera that has a lens. You can't see what's on the other side without that lens. And so this is the lens: equity, equal protection, inclusion. That is the lens we should be applying to every aspect and facet of education, research, teaching, patient care, everything that we're doing. It's not just one bucket.
What are the prospects and what might some of the strategies be for, getting institutions and perhaps even the Trump administration to walk this walk with respect to subfields within medicine that have that are greatly skewed in one direction? And you bring up gender as well. We can talk about race and ethnicity, but there's also gender. If we find a subfield that's highly skewed in one direction, grossly disproportionate in its representation, what are some of the investigative and other strategies that can be pursued? And in the gender realm, you can flip this. Well, you might say, I don't know the precise numbers, say for cardiac surgery, but I suspect that they skew very heavily in favor of male. But there are other fields that skew in favor of female. Pediatrics per se, for example. What can be done at the medical school leadership level by way of probing this and pushing back to achieve a greater balance within all these fields?
I think if we walk back from the data, if you consider cases, for example, in healthcare disparities, where we know that some populations are disproportionately impacted by certain diseases, then if we take this idea of equal protection, then are we offering equal protection to all patients if they aren't not able to access the care that they need, the quality health care? I think about, for example, I'm trained as a psychologist and I'm a bilingual psychologist, and recognizing that there is no equal protection for patients if you're not able to provide the language services that allow them to understand what their what the doctors are prescribing to them, how to take the medication. So are we protecting our patients equally when we are not able to offer them the services that they need to be able to take care of themselves? So I think those are the questions we would want to ask.
Uh-huh. Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Norma and Brian and Demisha. and Rukaya for your comments up today. And all of our panelists have written and spoken a fair amount on these and related issues, and you can access their work online. And I think it's worth emphasizing what I see as a common theme here, that there's a whole lot that's been said in our media that suggests that the winds are what they are, and we can't turn this around. And I think our panelists have said in different ways that there's a whole lot of overcompliance, pre-compliance, compliance that's not necessary, compliance that may actually lead to greater legal vulnerability rather than less. And that rather than sailing with what some think the wind is, we should, healthcare institutions and health educators should, and general counsels at universities and colleges should give more creative thought and less herd-like thought to what the possibilities are for pursuing objectives of fairness and equity in health and education that are, we fear, going by the boards in the current climate. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.